The lieutenant's voice was like steel, scraping stone, cold and unforgiving. Jacket, now. In his eyes, she was just a civilian flaunting the rules, a problem to be corrected. He had no idea he was about to confront a ghost, a living shadow from a program so secret its existence was a myth whispered only in the darkest corners of military intelligence. He thought he was enforcing a dress code, but he was about to unlock a past that could get them all killed. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The narrative then rewound, pulling back from the precipice of that confrontation to the quiet dawn of the same day. Tessa Vale's apartment was a testament to a life curated with monastic precision. The environment was minimalist and controlled, a sanctuary of muted grays and clean, uncluttered lines. Sunlight, sharp and golden in the early morning, streamed through the large window, illuminating the lazy dance of dust motes in the air, the only chaotic element in an otherwise perfectly ordered world. The only other thing that seemed out of place, a deliberate contradiction to the serene decor, was a worn, heavy-duty black jacket draped over the back of a sleek chrome chair. It was a relic, its fabric faded, and its seams showing the faintest signs of immense strain, a dark blot on a pristine canvas. Her morning ritual was a silent meditation, the mechanical whir of the coffee grinder, the careful bloom of hot water over fresh grounds, the slow, patient drip into a ceramic mug. Each step was deliberate, a small act of control that anchored her to the present. She took her coffee and her tablet to the small table overlooking the city, which was just beginning to stir 6 stories below. On the screen, complex schematics for a naval stealth prototype shifted and reformed at her touch. She was a brilliant civilian engineer, a mind the Navy coveted for its ability to solve impossible problems. Today's problem was thermal signature suppression on a new class of submersible drone. She ran a simulation, watching the 3D model of the drone's hull glow with heat before a cascade of her theoretical adjustments cooled it to a deep, invisible blue. This was her world now. Logic, physics, and predictable outcomes. Tessa cherished the simple peace of this life, the profound anonymity it afforded her, the predictable rhythm of her work, the quiet solitude of her apartment. It was all a stark, welcome contrast to a former life she had buried so deep it felt like a half-forgotten dream. The quiet was more than just an absence of noise. It was a sanctuary, a fortress she had fought with every fiber of her being to build around herself. She had earned this peace, paid for it with a currency of blood and sweat and memory. The sudden shrill ring of her encrypted phone was a violation, a sound so alien in the morning's calm that it made her flinch. She answered, her voice flat. Vale. The voice on the other end was clipped, official, and devoid of pleasantries. Miss Vale, this is Commander Zheng's office. We have a Priority 1 systems integration review. Your presence is required on base within the hour. Tessa's fingers tightened on her mug. A Priority 1 review? For a project that was still in the theoretical stage? It made no sense. I wasn't aware of any review today, she stated, keeping her tone even. It was unscheduled, the voice replied, offering no further explanation. Coronado, checkpoint Delta, within the hour. The line went dead. The abruptness of the summons, the sheer lack of protocol, felt wrong. It was a discordant note in her carefully composed symphony of a life, and it put a cold, familiar knot of dread in the pit of her stomach. She looked at the black jacket on the chair. It was practical, designed to carry the specialized diagnostic tools she would need. With a sigh of resignation, she finished her coffee, stood, and slipped it on. It felt heavier than usual. Naval Base Coronado smelled of salt, hot asphalt, and the faint metallic tang of jet fuel. It was a city unto itself, a place of immense power and unyielding purpose. Checkpoint Delta was a sterile, windowless room tucked away in a featureless concrete building. The walls were painted a harsh, institutional white, and the air hummed with the irritating buzz of overhead fluorescent lights. The authority in the room was a palpable force, emanating from the 2 armed guards who stood like statues flanking a heavy steel desk, and even more so from the man who stood behind it. Lieutenant K. Donovan was the very epitome of military authority. He was carved from granite and regulation, with a chiseled jaw, a perfectly pressed uniform, and sharp, assessing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He exuded an aura of supreme confidence and a rigid, almost fanatical adherence to protocol. His posture was ramrod straight, his every movement economical and precise. On the breast of his uniform, above a neat row of ribbons, gleamed the coveted gold of the Navy SEAL trident. He was a man who had been to the darkest places on Earth and had imposed order upon them. He lived by a code, and he expected the rest of the world to do the same, especially when they were standing on his base. Tessa approached the desk and presented her credentials. Cade took them without a word. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, flicked from her ID photo to her face, then back again. They were cold, impartial, and utterly unimpressed. Then, his gaze dropped, and it lingered on her non-regulation tactical jacket. He saw it not as clothing, but as a piece of unauthorized gear. It was a custom piece, weathered from use but clearly of the highest quality, with reinforced seams, a drag handle at the collar, and specialized, low-profile pockets that were not meant for civilian diagnostic tools. It was an affront. "Miss Vale," he said, his tone clipped and dismissive. He slid her ID back across the desk. "Your credentials appear to be in order." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air for a beat. "Your attire, however, is not." Tessa felt a familiar wave of exhaustion wash over her. It was the kind of petty power play she despised, the flexing of authority for its own sake. She kept her expression neutral, her voice calm. "It's just a jacket, Lieutenant. It's practical for carrying the diagnostic tools I need for the review. On my base, civilians follow protocol," Cade stated, his voice flat and hard. He tapped a finger on a laminated copy of the base regulations that was bolted to the desk. "That jacket is a violation of 3 separate dress code mandates for non-enlisted personnel in a secure zone. It mimics tactical gear, which is unauthorized." He wasn't just reciting a rule, he was delivering a judgment. Internally, Tessa debated the merits of arguing versus complying. The weariness of her past, a past that had taught her the value of invisibility, urged her towards simple compliance. Just take it off, get through the day, and disappear back into her quiet life. But another part of her, a stubborn, resilient core, bristled at the injustice. It was a practical piece of equipment for her job, nothing more. His objection was arbitrary, a display of dominance. Cade, however, misinterpreted her quiet contemplation. He saw her calm as defiance, her silence as the disrespect of a civilian who believed her intellect placed her above the rules of his world. He had seen it 100 times before. Contractors and engineers who walked onto his base with an air of superiority, acting as if the regulations that governed the lives of uniformed personnel were beneath them. The uniform, the base, the code he lived by, these things were sacred to him. He had bled for the trident on his chest. This woman, with her calm dismissal of his authority, was disrespecting everything he stood for. He decided, in that instant, to make an example of her. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the steel desk, his voice dropping to a low, intense register that was far more threatening than a shout. "I am not asking again, Miss Vale," he said, the words spaced for emphasis. "Remove the jacket, or I will have your access for the day revoked and file a formal conduct complaint with your program director." The air in the room became charged, heavy with tension. The 2 guards, who had been perfectly still, reacted to the shift in their lieutenant's tone. They didn't move much, but their bodies tensed, and their hands drifted almost unconsciously closer to the grips of their sidearms. The low hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to swell, filling the silence. The confrontation was no longer about a piece of clothing. It had become a battle of wills, a stark line drawn in the sterile white room, and Lieutenant K. Donovan had just made it clear that he was not the one who was going to back down. The air in the checkpoint, already thick with unspoken challenge, seemed to solidify. The low hum of the fluorescent lights, a moment ago merely an irritating background noise, now seemed to amplify the charged silence, pressing in on them from all sides. Tessa held Cade's gaze, the challenge in his eyes, meeting a profound ancient weariness in hers. For a long moment that stretched into an eternity, the two were locked in a silent battle of wills, a clash between unyielding military order and the quiet, stubborn resilience of a woman who had nothing left to prove. Then, with a slow, deliberate sigh, that was not one of submission but of grim, tired acceptance, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Her movements, when they came, were a study in fluid economy, a stark, shocking contrast to the rigid, angry posture of the man before her. She didn't snatch at the zipper in frustration. She didn't yank the jacket off in a fit of pique. Instead, her fingers found the pull tab and drew it down with a smooth, quiet rasp that was unnervingly loud in the deadened room. She shrugged the heavy garment from her shoulders, and as she did, she turned slightly, a subtle, calculated motion, as if to place the jacket on the corner of the steel desk. The movement was intentionally understated, yet it was perfectly executed. a piece of flawless choreography designed to expose the pale, unmarked skin over her left shoulder blade to the harsh, sterile light. And there it was. The stark black ink of the tattoo stood out against her skin like a brand, a sigil from a forgotten war. It was not a crude, amateurish design, but a piece of intricate, deadly art, etched with a precision that spoke of immense significance and a terrible purpose. A spectral owl, its wings faded as if woven from smoke and shadow, seemed to materialize on her back, its form both ethereal and menacing. Its eyes were wide and predatory, rendered with a detail that made them seem to glow with an intelligence that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. And there, in the very center of the owl's right eye, a tiny, perfect detail that drew the eye and chilled the soul, was the unmistakable, razor-sharp crosshair of a sniper's reticle. It was a symbol of a ghost, a mark of a hunter that did not exist, the crest of a phantom. The room stopped. The world seemed to stop. The humming lights, the distant clang of metal on the base, the very air itself seemed to freeze, caught in the grip of a power it did not understand. The two guards, young men trained for violence and confrontation, went utterly still, their eyes wide with a confusion so profound it bordered on a primal fear. They didn't understand what they were seeing, but they understood the reaction of their lieutenant, and that was enough to chill them to the bone. Lieutenant K. Donovan's breath hitched in his throat, a sharp, audible gasp that was a shocking betrayal of his iron control. His face, a moment ago a mask of arrogant, unyielding authority, drained of all color, leaving behind a waxy, pale sheen, as if he had seen a specter. His mind, a place of order and regulation, became a maelstrom of fractured memories and half-forgotten warnings. He was suddenly a junior officer again, barely 22 years old, sitting in a windowless, soundproofed room deep in the bowels of the Pentagon. A grizzled, four-star general was giving a briefing so highly classified that the files were projected onto a screen and then immediately deleted, never committed to paper, their existence denied before they had even fully registered. A briefing about a ghost unit, a program that officially, unequivocally, never existed. The Phantom Unit. He remembered the symbol, a symbol he was told he would never see, a symbol that meant its bearer was more myth than man, a weapon that had been decommissioned from reality itself. One of the young guards, a kid barely out of his teens and completely adrift in the sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere, saw his invincible lieutenant, a Navy SEAL who had faced down enemies in every corner of the globe, now looking as if he had been struck by lightning. The guard's training failed him, his discipline evaporated, and he whispered, the sound shockingly loud in the dead silence, "Sir, what is that?" Kay didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his tongue a leaden weight in his mouth. When he finally found his voice, it was unrecognizable. All the steel, all the authority had been stripped away, leaving behind a strangled, hoarse whisper that was raw with disbelief and a dawning, terrible understanding. "Lock it down," he croaked, his eyes still fixed on the tattoo as if it might spring to life. "Now, no one in or out, not a word over the radio." He tore his gaze away from Tessa's back and met the confused eyes of the senior guard, his own wide with a terror he had never known before. "Get me Commander Thorne on a hard line. Tell him it's a Valkyrie event." The word Valkyrie hung in the air, a name of power and myth that shattered the last vestiges of normalcy in the room. It was a word that did not belong in this bright, sterile space, a word forged in shadow and whispered in fear. The guards, jolted from their stupor by the raw, unadulterated urgency in Cade's voice, scrambled to follow his orders. Their movements, usually so crisp and practiced, were clumsy with a shock that bypassed training and struck at a more primal level of instinct. One fumbled with the secure comms panel, his fingers, thick with muscle and calluses, shaking as he struggled to key in the override code to establish the encrypted hardline. The other lunged for the door controls, slamming his palm against the large red button with a force that was born of pure panic. The magnetic lock on the heavy steel door engaged with a deafening percussive clang, a sound of absolute finality that echoed in the small, sterile space, sealing them in from the outside world. They were now in quarantine, though no one knew what the contagion was. Tessa remained perfectly still for a moment longer, a statue of calm in the eye of a hurricane she had created. She allowed the weight of Cade's words, the weight of that long dead name, to settle over her like a shroud. Then, with the same unhurried, deliberate grace she had displayed moments before, she calmly slipped her black jacket back on. The heavy fabric slid over her shoulder, a curtain falling on a forbidden stage, hiding the spectral owl once more, concealing the ghost beneath the skin. She zipped it up, the sound another sharp metallic rasp in the tense silence, and turned to face the room. Her expression was an unreadable mask of placid neutrality, her eyes giving away nothing of the storm that was beginning to rage within her. For Lieutenant Cade Donovan, the world had been irrevocably, seismically turned upside down. His rigid, black and white worldview, a structure built on the solid bedrock of protocol, chain of command, and the clear distinction between friend and foe, had not just been cracked, it had been pulverized. The Phantom Unit, it was a bogeyman story, a myth whispered in hushed tones in the barracks of Fort Bragg and the ready rooms of Coronado to scare new recruits. A cautionary tale about soldiers who flew too close to the sun and were burned to ash. They were said to be the elite of the elite tier. One operators handpicked from every branch of the Special Forces, from the SEALs, from Delta Force, from the Green Berets, and then utterly and completely erased. Their service records were wiped, their families told they were dead in tragic accidents, their very existence denied by the government they served with a ferocity that bordered on paranoia. Their mission, as the old, four-star general had explained in that secret briefing all those years ago, his voice a low rumble in the soundproofed room, was to be the nation's deniable assassins, its most secret spies, its most effective saboteurs. They were the scalpel to be used in the dark when the hammer of the conventional military was too loud, too clumsy, too public. The general had called them necessary evils, a term that had made Cade's younger, more idealistic self deeply uncomfortable. They were ghosts, tasked with doing the nation's dirty work and then fading back into the shadows, their only reward, the continued, ignorant safety of the country they protected. The official file, the one that didn't exist, stated that the entire unit had been designated killed in action during a catastrophic training accident in the late 1990s. A Black Hawk helicopter crash in a remote, undisclosed mountain range during a storm, no survivors. A neat, tidy end to a program that had become too dangerous, too unaccountable, its operators too skilled in the art of disappearing. It was a lie, Cade now realized with sickening certainty. A clean, efficient, government-sanctioned lie to bury a terrible truth. And here, standing before him in a sterile checkpoint room, was the living, breathing proof of that lie. The unit's crest, the spectral owl with the crosshair in its eye, was tattooed on the shoulder of a civilian engineer who built stealth drones for a living. The contradiction was so immense, so reality-bending, that his mind struggled to process it, like a computer trying to divide by zero. While Cade's universe imploded, Tessa was experiencing a different kind of collapse. A cold dread, mixed with a grim, weary sense of inevitability, seeped into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the room's air conditioning. She had hoped this day would never come, had prayed to gods she no longer believed in that it wouldn't. For over a decade, she had meticulously constructed the life of Tessa Vale, a life of quiet purpose and deliberate obscurity. She had buried the other woman, the one they called Valkyrie, in a grave of memory, piling years of peace and normalcy on top of it like so much dirt and stone. But the past, she knew, was never truly dead. It was merely dormant, a sleeping dragon that could be woken by a single, careless word. The name Valkyrie echoed in the silent chambers of her mind, a ghost from another life, another world. It was a name that tasted of cordite and ozone, of the thin, cold air of high altitudes, of the metallic tang of fear and the bitter ash of regret. A fleeting image flashed behind her eyes, unbidden and unwelcome, a snow, dusted ridgeline somewhere in the Balkans, the feel of a cold rifle stock against her cheek, the world reduced to the perfect, clear circle of her scope. She pushed it down, ruthlessly suppressing the memory. She could feel the weight of that identity settling back onto her shoulders, an invisible mantle far heavier than any jacket. The piece she had so carefully built was fracturing, the foundations cracking under the seismic shock of that single word. She was no longer just Tessa Vale, engineer. The ghost was awake, and it was hungry. The wait for Commander Thorne was agonizingly long. It stretched from minutes into what felt like an eternity, each second drawn out and amplified by the suffocating tension. The senior guard spoke in low, clipped tones on the hard line, his back to the room, his voice a tense, urgent murmur. The younger guard stood by the door, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm, his knuckles white. His eyes darted nervously between the impossibly calm woman and his shell, shocked lieutenant, as if trying to decide which of them was the greater threat. The only sound in the room was the incessant, maddening hum of the overhead fluorescent lights, a sound that seemed to be drilling directly into Cade's skull. Cade didn't speak to Tessa. He couldn't. What could he possibly say? Sorry for blowing your deep cover over a dress code violation? He, who had built his career on his ability to assess and control any situation, was utterly, hopelessly out of his depth. He just stared at her, his mind replaying the image of the tattoo over and over again, trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the legend from the briefing. The smoky wings, the predatory eyes, the crosshair. The implications spiraled outwards, growing more complex and more dangerous with each passing second. This woman wasn't just a civilian who had somehow acquired a classified tattoo. She was one of them, a phantom, a living ghost. He was no longer a lieutenant chastising a civilian. He was a man who had stumbled into a secret cemetery and found one of the dead standing there, waiting for him. And he had the sickening feeling that by forcing her to reveal herself, he had not just broken a rule, he had broken a seal on something terrible, something that had been meant to stay buried forever. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of noise. It was the silence of a tomb that had just been opened, and they were all trapped inside with whatever had come out. The heavy clang of the magnetic lock was still echoing in the small room when a different sound replaced it, a quiet, electronic beep from the door's external control panel. The handle turned, and the door swung inward, not with a crash of tactical boots, but with a quiet, controlled swish. The man who entered was not a soldier, not in the way Kay Donovan was a soldier. He was in his late 50s, his uniform immaculate but worn with the comfortable familiarity of a second skin. His temples were dusted with gray, and his eyes, a deep, intelligent brown, held the profound weariness of a man who had carried too many secrets for far too long. This was Commander Thorne, and he moved with a quiet, unassuming authority that instantly dwarfed Cade's aggressive, rigid posture. He didn't need to project power, he simply was power. Thorne's gaze swept the room in a single, all-encompassing glance, a practiced assessment that took in every detail in a fraction of a second. He saw the two tense, confused guards, their youth and inexperience practically radiating off them. He saw Lieutenant Donovan, his face pale and his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror, and finally his gaze landed on Tessa. She met his look without flinching, her own expression a placid, unreadable mask. For a moment, the two of them were the only people in the room, two figures from a forgotten world who had just recognized each other across a vast, unbridgeable chasm of time. Thorne's voice, when he spoke, was low, but it carried the absolute, unquestionable weight of command. "Out," he said, his gaze still locked on Tessa, though his words were for the others. "All of you." He finally turned his head, looking at Cade and the guards as if seeing them for the first time. "Secure the corridor. No one approaches this room until I say so. Not a single soul." He then pinned Cade with a look that was both sharp and strangely paternal. "Lieutenant, you will wait outside, and you will not speak of this to anyone, not your men, not your commanding officer, not your priest. Is that understood?" Cade, who moments before had been the undisputed authority in this room, was now humbled, out of his depth, and utterly adrift. He felt like a raw recruit being dressed down by a drill instructor. He could only manage a single, jerky nod, the muscles in his neck tight with tension. He turned, his movements stiff and robotic, and led his equally bewildered guards out of the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind them. The click of the latch was a quiet, final sound. Thorne turned back to Tessa, the silence of the room now, a different kind of silence, one of shared history and unspoken truths. The hardness in his eyes, the look of a commander assessing a threat, softened slightly, replaced by a deep, profound weariness that seemed to emanate from his very soul. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound heavy with the weight of years and the ghosts of fallen soldiers. "Valkyrie," he said, the name a quiet exhalation, a word spoken with a mixture of disbelief, regret, and a strange, dark reverence. "I'll be damned!" He shook his head slowly, a small, sad smile touching the corners of his lips. "We read the eulogies at your funeral, the whole unit. It was a very moving service. The flag folding ceremony was particularly well done." Tessa's expression remained unchanged, but her voice, when she replied, was quiet and devoid of any discernible emotion, as flat and cold as a winter landscape. "That was the point, Commander," she said. "The funeral, the eulogies, the folded flag." She paused, her gaze unwavering. "Tessa Vale is supposed to be a quiet life." Thorne nodded, accepting her words at face value. He didn't press, he didn't demand answers. Instead, he pulled one of the hard plastic chairs away from the wall and sat down, the simple, informal action transforming the sterile security checkpoint into an impromptu interrogation space. He gestured to the other chair, an unspoken invitation, Tessa remained standing. He didn't push, he just waited. His patience, a tangible force in the room, the patience of a man who knew that some secrets, like deep, splintered wounds, could not be forced open. They had to be coaxed out, gently, carefully, lest they cause even more damage. Finally, Tessa spoke, her voice a low monotone, as if she were reciting a technical manual rather than recounting the story of her own death. Through their quiet, stilted conversation, the story of the Phantom Unit, a story that had never been written down, a story that existed only in the memories of a handful of men and women, was finally given voice. They were an experimental group, she explained, funded by a black budget so deep it was effectively invisible, its funds siphoned from a dozen different, unrelated projects. They were trained to be the ultimate deniable asset, a scalpel for a nation that sometimes needed to perform surgery in the dark, away from the prying eyes of the world. They answered to a single, shadowy committee, their missions sanctioned by whispers and nods in rooms that officially did not exist. Tessa, a prodigy scout sniper recruited from a special forces training program before her 20th birthday, a girl who could shoot the wings off a fly at 2,000 yards, was one of its founding members. Her call sign was Valkyrie, a name given to her by her spotter for the almost supernatural calm she possessed in the heart of chaos. She explained that after a mission in Eastern Europe, a mission to eliminate a warlord who was financing his genocide by selling stolen chemical weapons, went horribly, catastrophically wrong, she couldn't continue. The mission had resulted in the death of her spotter, a man who had been like a brother to her, and the unintended, unavoidable deaths of civilian casualties, a family caught in the crossfire of a war they had no part in. The official story, the one fed to the military and the world, was a catastrophic training accident. A helicopter crash in a storm, a fiery end that wiped out the entire unit in one fell swoop. It was a clean, tragic, and utterly believable lie. In reality, the handful of survivors, scattered and broken by their final mission, were brought in, one by one. They were given a choice, a simple, brutal binary. They could accept a new identity, a new life, meticulously crafted and paid for by the same government that was erasing their old one, or they could accept a shallow, unmarked grave in a place no one would ever find, a real death to go with their official one. Tessa chose the former. She took her innate technical aptitude, a skill she had honed to maintain her specialized equipment, and used it to build a new life, a new identity, as a quiet, brilliant civilian engineer. She had traded her rifle for a tablet, her scope for a schematic. As she recounted the story of that failed mission, her voice remained detached, her expression cool and distant. It was a clinical recitation of facts, a debriefing delivered years too late. But beneath the icy surface of her control, Thorne could sense the deep, unresolved trauma, the wound that had never healed, the memory of the collateral damage, the faces of the innocent people caught in the crossfire, the look in her spotter's eyes as he lay dying. These were the ghosts that truly haunted her, the ones she had built her quiet, orderly life to keep at bay. This was why she craved peace and order, why she clung to the predictable logic of physics and engineering. It was a sanctuary from the chaotic, unpredictable, and often monstrous world of human conflict she had left behind. Thorne listened patiently, his gaze never leaving her face, his expression one of deep, empathetic sorrow. He had sent men on missions like that. He had read the after-action reports, the cold, sterile language that papered over the human cost of their secret wars. When she finally fell silent, the story told, the ghost given its due, he let the silence hang in the air for a long moment before he spoke. "I didn't come for a history lesson, Valkyrie," he said, his voice gentle but firm, pulling her back to the present. "Though God knows, someone should write it down someday." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his expression turning grim. "I came because we have a situation, and your ghost has just appeared at the very center of it." He explained that Dr. Alistair Finch, a leading government scientist in the field of directed energy weapons, a man whose work was so advanced it was considered 2 generations ahead of anything else on the planet, had been abducted from a secure MI6 facility in London less than 48 hours ago. The name hit Tessa like a physical blow, a small, almost imperceptible flinch that was the first crack in her icy composure. She had known Finch. Years ago, before the final mission, before everything fell apart, she and her spotter had been assigned to his protection detail for 6 months. He was a brilliant, eccentric, and fundamentally decent man who had treated them not as guards, but as colleagues. Thorne saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes and continued, his voice low and urgent. The abduction was clean, incredibly clean. The entire security team, A dozen of the best men MI6 had were neutralized with terrifying efficiency. Non-lethal, but brutally effective. They were in and out in under 4 minutes. No alarms were tripped, no surveillance footage was captured. It was a ghost operation. He pulled a tablet from inside his jacket and slid it across the desk toward her. Tessa looked down. The screen showed a single, high-resolution crime scene photograph. It was a sterile, white laboratory, much like the room they were in now. The bodies of the guards were scattered across the floor, their limbs at odd angles, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and pain. But that wasn't what held her attention. On the far wall, drawn in what looked like chalk taken from the lab's own blackboard, was a crude, hastily drawn symbol. It was a single, broken owl's wing. Tessa stared at the image, her blood turning to ice in her veins. The symbol was a message, a piece of a language that only a handful of people on the planet could understand. It was a signal from the grave, a call from one ghost to another. Thorne's voice dropped to a near whisper, heavy with a dawning, terrible realization. The kidnappers used tactics that only a handful of people on the planet would know. They moved like shadows, they fought like demons, and they vanished without a trace. He tapped a finger on the image of the broken wing on the tablet's screen. They left this. We thought it was a message for us, a taunt, a calling card from a new player on the world stage. He looked up, his weary eyes meeting hers, and the full, terrifying weight of the situation finally settled over them. Now I see it wasn't for us at all. He paused, letting the truth land with the force of a sledgehammer. It was for you. Thorne led Tessa from the sterile confinement of the checkpoint, his silence a heavy blanket. They moved through a series of corridors that burrowed deeper into the heart of the naval base. Each checkpoint they passed, escalating in security and technological sophistication. Keycard readers gave way to biometric scanners. Armed guards in standard uniforms were replaced by elite marine security teams in full combat gear, their faces grim and their eyes missing nothing. The air grew colder, the lighting more subdued. It was a descent, a journey into a subterranean world of secrets and power, a world Tessa had once called home and had spent the last decade trying to forget. Finally, Thorne pressed his thumb against a small, unmarked panel on a seamless grey wall. A section of the wall slid open with a near, silent hiss, revealing the room beyond. It was a high-tech, soundproof briefing room, a tactical cocoon designed for waging secret wars. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of ozone and chilled electronics. The walls were dominated by a mosaic of large, interactive screens, currently displaying a dizzying array of satellite imagery, personnel files with blacked-out sections, and complex tactical diagrams of the MI6 facility in London. In the center of the room was a large, black conference table, its surface polished to a mirror finish. And sitting at that table, looking chastened, confused, and utterly out of place, was Lieutenant Cade Donovan. He stood abruptly as they entered, his body automatically snapping to a position of attention, a conditioned reflex in the presence of a superior officer. His eyes, however, were fixed on Tessa, his expression a turbulent storm of confusion, resentment, and a dawning, grudging respect that he clearly found distasteful. He looked like a man who had been forced to acknowledge that the fundamental laws of physics as he understood them were wrong. Thorne ignored Cade's rigid posture and walked to the head of the table, gesturing for Tessa to take a seat. She did, moving with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with the room's aggressive purpose. "At ease, Lieutenant," Thorne said, his voice calm but leaving no room for argument. He brought up a new file on the main screen, a single page of text so heavily redacted it was more black than white. "What was said in the checkpoint, what you saw, does not exist. The program it was connected to, for all official purposes, never existed. It was a defunct, experimental initiative from the late 1990s, and its operational records were sealed and buried under a mountain of classification. I couldn't get through with a decade of trying." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "However, its legacy, it would appear, has come back to haunt us. The individuals involved were trained to a standard that is, to put it mildly, outside the conventional spectrum of special operations. They were ghosts, and the man who abducted Dr. Finch is one of them." Thorne's gaze shifted from Cade to Tessa, a silent transfer of authority, which is why, for the duration of this crisis, Miss Vale is the operational lead. She has full tactical authority. You and your team will provide support, security, and resources as she requires them. You will follow her orders as if they were my own. This is a direct command from Naval Special Warfare Command, and it is not a matter for debate." Cade's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He opened his mouth to protest, the ingrained training of a lifetime, screaming that this was a violation of every protocol he had ever known. But the protest died in his throat as Tessa, who had been ignoring him completely, leaned forward, her eyes scanning the screens with an intensity that was almost frightening. Her mind, once focused on the elegant logic of engineering schematics, was now processing tactical information with a speed and clarity that was breathtaking. She was no longer Tessa Vale, the quiet engineer. She was Valkyrie, and she was waking up. She pointed a slender finger at a schematic of the London facility's ventilation system. "Here," she said, her voice crisp and clear, devoid of the flat, emotionless tone she had used before. It was the voice of a commander. "The seismic sensors on the west wall have a refresh rate of 1.5 seconds. The floor plates are pressure sensitive, but they're calibrated to ignore anything under 170 pounds to avoid false positives from equipment cards." She zoomed in on a different diagram, this one showing the building's power grid. They didn't cut the power. They would have known that would trigger an immediate lockdown and a hardwired alarm to GCHQ. Instead, they introduced a micro surge into the surveillance system's dedicated circuit, just enough to scramble the recording servers for a full minute without tripping the breaker. A two-man team, moving in perfect sync, can cross the floor from the ventilation access point to the lab door in 1.3 seconds if they're carrying minimal gear. They practiced extensively. She looked up from the screen, her gaze sweeping over Thorne and Cade. This wasn't a smash and grab. It was a performance. It was a statement. Cade watched her, his initial animosity and confusion being rapidly replaced by a growing sense of awe that bordered on intimidation. This woman, this civilian he had dismissed and belittled, was operating on a strategic and tactical level he could barely comprehend. She saw the battlefield in 4 dimensions, dissecting the enemy's actions with the precision of a surgeon, seeing the ghost in the machine that MI6's entire security apparatus had missed. He, a Navy SEAL, a warrior who had been forged in the crucible of combat, felt like a raw rookie in her presence, a blunt instrument in a room that required a scalpel. The world of black and white, of clear orders and defined objectives, was dissolving around him, replaced by a world of shadows and whispers, a world this woman navigated as if she had been born in it. Despite the awe, his training and his pride still fought back, a last bastion of the order he understood. He turned to Thorne, his voice tight with a frustration he was struggling to contain. "Commander, with all due respect, she's a civilian. My team is one of the best in the world. We should be leading the recovery effort. We can be in the air in an hour." Tessa didn't even look at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen, on the cold, hard data of the problem in front of her. "Your team," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a shard of ice, "would go in loud and fast. You'd breach doors, throw flashbangs, and announce your presence to the entire world. You'd trigger a dead man's switch and get the asset killed before you even cleared the first room." She finally turned her head, her eyes, cold and clear as a winter sky, pinning him in place. "The person who took Finch isn't a common terrorist or a state-sponsored operative. He's a ghost. He's one of mine." The possessive pronoun hung in the air, a claim of ownership and a terrible burden. "You don't hunt a ghost with a hammer, Lieutenant. You use another ghost."
No.
The finality in her tone was absolute. It was not an argument. It was a statement of fact, a law of this new, shadowy universe he had stumbled into. Cade fell silent, the last of his objections crumbling to dust in the face of her chilling confidence. Tessa, however, turned her gaze to Thorne, and for the first time, a flicker of the old weariness, the deep-seated desire for peace, returned to her eyes. "I can't do this," she said, her voice losing its hard edge, becoming quiet again. "I won't. That life is over. I buried it for a reason. I am an engineer. I solve problems with math, not with a bullet. Find someone else." It was a plea, the desperate appeal of a woman who had fought her way out of hell and was now being ordered to go back. Thorne's expression was one of profound sympathy, but his resolve was like iron. "There is no one else, Valkyrie," he said softly. "You know that." He knew he was asking the impossible, asking a soldier who had already given everything to give more. He hesitated, then made his final move, the one he knew would leave her with no choice at all. The kidnapper didn't send his demands to MI6, or the CIA, or any government agency. He manipulated the controls on the table, and a new image appeared on the main screen. It was a screenshot of a message board, its design archaic and text-based, a relic from the early days of the internet. The forum was encrypted, anonymous, and existed on a corner of the dark web so obscure that only a handful of people even knew of its existence. It was a digital dead drop, a place for ghosts to leave messages for other ghosts. Tessa felt her stomach clench. She recognized it instantly. It was the board the phantoms had used to pass untraceable messages to each other, a secret clubhouse for the dead. And there, at the top of the board, was a single, new post. It was from an anonymous user, but the message itself was a signature. It read, "Valkyrie, I have the key. Come and claim him before he unlocks the wrong door. The game is the same, the board is just bigger." Tessa stared at the words, each one a hammer blow against the walls of the sanctuary she had built. The key. That was their old code name for Dr. Finch, the man who held the key to unlocking the future of warfare. The game is the same. The cold, intellectual rivalry, the deadly competition of skill and strategy. The board is just bigger, not a training exercise, not a simulated mission, but the real world. Her blood ran cold. The style, the arrogance, the chillingly playful tone. She knew it as well as she knew her own heartbeat. It wasn't just a former phantom. It was him, the one she had hoped she would never see again, the one whose ghost had haunted her more than any other. Thorne's voice was a grave whisper in the silent room. "It's Wraith, isn't it?" Tessa didn't answer. She just stared at the screen, at the message that was both a challenge and a death sentence. She had run from her past, buried her ghosts, and built a new life in the light. But one of those ghosts had just clawed its way out of the grave, and it had called her out to play. The game was the same, and she was the only one who knew the rules. The scene dissolved from the cold, sterile briefing room to the gritty, tangible reality of a rain-slicked alley in Hamburg, Germany. The transition was jarring, a physical manifestation of their descent from the theoretical world of strategy into the cold, hard ground of the hunt. The location had been derived from a complex cipher embedded in the dark web post's metadata, a digital breadcrumb only Tessa could have followed. The air in the narrow alley was cold and heavy, thick with the smells of stale beer from a nearby pub, the damp decay of old brickwork, and the briny, industrial scent of the nearby harbor. A constant, miserable drizzle fell from a bruised purple sky, coating every surface in a slick, greasy sheen, and turning the cobblestones into treacherous, dark mirrors. Tessa and Cade were now an operational team, a strange and dissonant pairing. Cade was a picture of military readiness, clad in matte black tactical gear, a compact carbine held in a low ready position, his movements economical and alert. He was a predator in his natural element, yet, standing beside him, Tessa seemed infinitely more dangerous. She wore the same civilian jacket, its dark fabric now soaked and clinging to her frame, but she moved with a fluid, predatory grace that made the hardened seal look stiff and mechanical by comparison. Her senses were alive, her eyes constantly scanning, not just looking at the alley but absorbing it, deconstructing it into angles, shadows, and potential threats. The cipher had led them not to a person or an address, but to a specific piece of graffiti that covered the entire side of a derelict warehouse. It was a chaotic mural of clashing colors and abstract shapes, meaningless to a casual observer. Cade saw only vandalism. Tessa saw a canvas for a hidden message. She pulled a small pen-sized device from her pocket and clicked it on, casting a beam of high-intensity ultraviolet light onto the wall. Under the invisible light, a new layer of the painting sprang to life. Hidden within the swirls of spray paint, a faint, ghostly set of coordinates shimmered in fluorescent green. "How did you know?" Cade's voice was a low rumble, his breath misting in the cold air. The question was not a challenge, but a genuine inquiry, the student asking the master. "He was call sign Wraith," Tessa said, her voice quiet, her eyes still fixed on the glowing numbers as if they might vanish. She was speaking as much to herself as to him, dredging up memories from a place she had sealed off long ago. He always believed in his own intellectual superiority above all else. For him, any conflict was a battle of wits first and a battle of force second. He won't just fight you, he'll prove he's smarter than you every single step of the way. This is him showing off. As she spoke, memories of Wraith surfaced, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. She remembered him in the brutal selection process for the Phantom program, a course designed to break even the most elite soldiers. While others relied on grit and physical endurance, Wraith had glided through the psychological and strategic challenges with an unnerving, cold brilliance. He saw patterns no one else did, solved problems with a logic that was both inspired and terrifyingly detached from human emotion. She recalled a specific training exercise, a hostage simulation. The objective was to neutralize the captors without harming the hostage. Wraith, instead of attempting a difficult, low, percentage shot, had calculated the building's structural weaknesses and triggered a localized collapse, killing the captors but also sacrificing the hostage. In the debrief, he had defended his actions with chilling clarity. The hostage was a statistical inevitability of failure, he had argued, his eyes cold and devoid of remorse. My solution guaranteed 100% mission success against the primary targets. He enjoyed the game too much, reveled in the intellectual puzzle of violence, and saw human lives as acceptable variables in his equations. A pang of guilt, cold and sharp, twisted in Tessa's gut. She had seen the cruelty in him then, the coldness that set him apart even from the other hardened operators. She had dismissed it as the necessary detachment of a soldier, but now she saw it for what it was, the budding bloom of a monster. She should have seen this coming. She should have stopped him back then, before he had the chance to grow into this. The coordinates led them to the decaying industrial outskirts of the harbor, to a derelict boat pen from a war fought long before they were born. It was a monstrous concrete structure, a tomb for forgotten leviathans of the deep, its cavernous interior dark and dripping with water that echoed like ghostly footsteps. Inside, in the center of the vast, empty space, sat a single, incongruous object, a laptop on a small folding table, its screen glowing in the oppressive darkness. There was no ambush, no traps. That wasn't Wraith's style for this stage of the game. This was theater. As they approached, a video on the laptop's screen began to play on a loop. It showed Dr. Finch, his face pale with terror, his eyes wide and pleading. He was in a workshop of some kind, and his hands, guided by an unseen captor, were frantically working on a complex electronic device, a nightmarish tangle of wires, circuit boards, and a glowing power core. In the corner of the screen, a digital countdown was displayed in stark red numbers, 72 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. Then the video froze on Finch's terrified face, and a new message typed itself out across the screen in a simple, clean font. You were always sentimental, Valkyrie. Remember Lisbon? The mission you couldn't finish? The scene shifted again, the cold, damp concrete of the U-boat pen replaced by the sterile, climate-controlled interior of a C-17 Globemaster transport jet. They were climbing through the dark, turbulent skies over Europe, the roar of the engines a constant, deafening presence. In the center of the cargo bay, a secure communication suite had been set up, and Commander Thorne's face, weary and etched with worry, looked out from a large monitor. Cade stood nearby, his helmet off, his expression grim and attentive. Tessa sat before the screen, a headset on, the black jacket draped over the back of her chair like a sleeping animal. She explained the Lisbon mission, her voice a low, steady monotone that belied the raw, agonizing memory she was exhuming. It was the mission that had broken her, the one that had shattered her faith in the program and in herself. Their task had been to eliminate a rogue arms dealer named Jovan Dragic, a man who was selling stolen NATO weaponry to terrorist cells. It was a high-stakes mission. Wraith was on overwatch, positioned on a rooftop 1,000 meters away, his rifle a tool of godlike power. Tessa was the primary shooter, concealed in an apartment overlooking the outdoor cafe where Dragic was scheduled to make the deal. Her shot was perfect, the variables of wind, distance, and humidity all accounted for. She had Dragic's head centered in her crosshairs. Just as she was about to gently squeeze the trigger, the world had tilted on its axis. Dragic, ever the paranoid monster, had done something unannounced, something that wasn't in any of their intelligence briefings. He had reached down and pulled a small child, a little girl no older than 7 with bright red ribbons in her hair, onto his lap, using her as an impromptu, unknowing human shield. Tessa hesitated. In that split second, 1,000 calculations ran through her mind, but they were not about ballistics, they were about morality. The girl's innocent face, the red ribbons, the absolute certainty that taking the shot meant ending that small, bright life. It was a line she could not cross. Wraith, from his distant perch, had no such hesitation. Through her earpiece, she heard him say a single, cold word, compensating. Before she could even process what he meant, the sharp crack of his rifle echoed through the square. He hadn't aimed for Dragic's head. He had aimed for the sliver of Dragic's upper torso that was visible over the child's shoulder. The high-caliber round had struck with devastating force, passing through Dragic and killing him instantly. But the bullet's massive energy transfer and fragmentation had also been fatal for the child. Wraith had taken the shot, killing both the dealer and the little girl. He had argued later, in the furious, bitter aftermath, that it was necessary to complete the mission, that the death of the child was an acceptable loss when weighed against the hundreds of lives that would have been lost if Dragic's weapons reached their destination. Tessa had argued it was a monstrous choice, an act that turned them from soldiers into the very monsters they were supposed to be fighting. The conflict, that fundamental schism in their philosophies, had led to the dissolution of their partnership and her eventual, final departure from the Phantom program. As Tessa finished her story, a heavy silence filled the jet, broken only by the roar of the engines. Cade stared at her, the last vestiges of his animosity gone, replaced by a raw, protective empathy. He was a SEAL. He had made hard choices, had seen terrible things, but killing a child and calling it necessary, that was a line that even in his world was rarely, if ever, crossed. He finally saw the raw, gaping wound behind her cold, controlled exterior. He understood her desperate need for a quiet life, the immense weight of the past she carried. His respect, already earned, deepened into something more, something that recognized her not just as a superior operator, but as a survivor who had endured an impossible trauma. "He killed a child," Cade said, his voice rough with a disbelief that bordered on rage, "and called it necessary?" Tessa finally looked at him, her eyes holding the ghosts of that day. "He called it acceptable losses," she corrected, her voice barely a whisper. "I called it the end. I left that world so I would never have to make a choice like that again." A sudden, terrible clarity dawned in her eyes. She looked back at the screen, at Thorne's worried face. "He's not just seeking revenge on the government," she said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening precision. "He's recreating our past. He's tormenting me, trying to prove that his philosophy, his cold, brutal calculus, was the correct one all along." She stood up, her movements now sharp and decisive. "He's forcing me to finish the game on his terms." She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, where he was going. Lisbon wasn't just about the mission. It was about what happened after. She looked at Thorne, her voice now ringing with absolute authority. "He's going to a decommissioned NATO listening post in the mountains of northern Portugal. It's where we had our final bitter argument after the mission. It's where I told him he was a monster." She paused, the final terrible piece of the puzzle falling into place. "And it's where he's going to make me become one, too." The mountaintop was a desolate, wind-swept purgatory at the edge of the world. The decommissioned NATO listening post was a skeleton of a forgotten era, its massive satellite dishes rusted and skeletal against a sky the color of a deep bruise. They pointed blindly at the heavens, deaf to any secrets the stars might whisper. Concrete bunkers, their walls crumbling and stained with decades of rain, hunkered into the rocky terrain like ancient sleeping beasts. The wind was a living entity here, a mournful, howling banshee that tore at their clothes and screamed through the latticework of the antennas, a constant, unnerving sound that frayed the nerves and chilled the soul. Tied securely to the central support of the largest antenna was Dr. Alistair Finch. His face was a mask of pure terror, his eyes wide and bloodshot. At his feet, bolted to the same support, was the device he had been forced to build. It was a prototype electromagnetic pulse weapon, a nightmarish fusion of stolen military hardware and Finch's own genius, now twisted into a tool of terror. A single, ominous green light pulsed from its core, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat counting down to annihilation. The device was armed, and it was linked to a simple, brutal pressure plate concealed beneath the metal folding chair Finch had been forced to sit on. If he stood up, or if his weight was removed for any other reason, the EMP would detonate, unleashing a wave of energy that would fry every piece of electronics within a 50-mile radius, plunging the entire region into darkness and chaos. It was a weapon of mass disruption, and Finch was its unwilling trigger. This was Wraith's stage, and he was the master of the performance. Cade and his small, four-man SEAL team were trapped, pinned down behind a series of crumbling concrete barriers 200 yards from Finch's position. Every attempt to advance was met with a single, perfectly placed sniper round that was not meant to kill, but to control. A shot would kick up a shower of stone chips just inches from a man's head, or punch a hole through a piece of their gear, a chillingly precise demonstration of Wraith's absolute dominance of the battlefield. He had herded them into a kill box of his own design, and they were powerless to move. The real fight, the only fight that mattered, was happening on a different plane, a silent, invisible war being waged between two ghosts. Tessa was positioned 1,000 yards away on an opposing ridge, nestled into a sniper's hide so perfect it was practically invisible, a natural depression in the rock that she had augmented with a camouflage screen. Her rifle, a state of the art piece of military hardware that felt like a phantom limb, was cool and steady in her hands. She had a clear line of sight to Finch, but Wraith's position was a mystery, a ghost in the machine of the decaying listening post. They were communicating over a private, encrypted radio frequency, a channel they had used in their old life, a direct line between shooter and spotter, between hunter and hunter. Wraith's voice crackled in her ear, smooth, arrogant, and laced with a chilling amusement. "Do you see the beauty of it, Valkyrie? The elegant simplicity. A perfect stalemate. Your pet soldiers can't move, and you can't risk a shot. The key is in the lock, and my finger is on the button. Checkmate. Techmate. This isn't a game, Wraith." Tessa's voice was low and steady, a stark contrast to the howling wind. "Isn't it?" he laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "It's always been a game, the most important game in the world, and they threw us away like broken toys." His voice hardened, the amusement replaced by a sudden, venomous fury. "We were weapons, Valkyrie, the sharpest blades the nation ever forged, and they got scared of us. They were afraid of what we could do, of the choices we were willing to make. I'm just reminding them what their weapons can do when they're taken off the leash." "We were soldiers, not monsters," Tessa countered, her eyes scanning the listening post, searching for the faintest hint of his position, a flicker of movement, the glint of a scope. "You chose this path, not them. You chose to become this." "I chose to win," he snarled. "You're the one who lost her nerve. You, with your sentimentality and your moral hand, ringing. Lisbon was the test, and you failed it. You let emotion cloud your judgment, and you hesitated. I did what needed to be done. I completed the mission. That's the only thing that matters." Tessa's mind flashed back to the little girl with the red ribbons, her face a silent scream in her memory. "What mattered was our humanity," she whispered into the microphone. "You sacrificed it. I chose to keep mine." She knew then that arguing with him was pointless. He was lost in his own twisted ideology, a prisoner of his own cold logic. She couldn't reason with him. She had to outthink him. She had to use his own arrogance, his own supreme confidence, against him. She knew him. She remembered him from the training grounds, from the endless hours they had spent together honing their deadly craft. She knew his tells, his patterns, his unshakable belief that he was the smartest man in any room, on any battlefield. He needed to prove it, not just by winning, but by demonstrating his superiority in a way that was undeniable. He needed to show her that he was better. It was a massive gamble, a one in a million shot that relied on a decade, old memory, and a deep, intuitive understanding of the man who was now her enemy. She took a deep, steadying breath, the cold mountain air filling her lungs. She shifted her position slightly, a deliberate, almost clumsy movement, exposing her left shoulder and the barrel of her rifle for a fraction of a second from behind her cover. It was a rookie mistake, a careless error that no trained sniper would ever make. It was bait. Wraith's reaction was instantaneous. The sharp crack of his rifle echoed across the mountaintop, a sound of triumphant finality. The bullet screamed past her, missing her by inches, exactly as she had known it would. He wasn't aiming to kill her, not yet. He was aiming to wound, to disable, to prove that he could have taken her out at any moment he chose. It was a shot of pure arrogance, but it was a misdirection. Her shot, the one she had fired in the exact same instant he had pulled his own trigger, was not aimed at him. As he had fired, the muzzle flash from his rifle had given her his exact position, a small, shadowed alcove in the upper level of the main concrete bunker. But she hadn't aimed for the man. She had aimed for a loose, rust-eaten piece of steel rebar that was dangling from the crumbling ceiling directly above his sniper's nest. The world seemed to slow down. Her bullet, a perfect instrument of physics and intent, struck the corroded metal with a high-pitched shriek. It didn't penetrate, it ricocheted. The round, deformed and spinning, shot downwards at an impossible angle. It didn't hit Wraith, it hit his rifle. The bullet slammed into the high-powered scope, shattering the complex system of lenses and mirrors into 1,000 tiny fragments. The weapon that had made him a god was now useless, a broken stick of metal and wood. It was a one in a million shot. A shot born not just of pure, unadulterated skill, but of a profound psychological insight that was more powerful than any bullet. Silence descended on the mountaintop, a sudden deafening absence of noise that was more shocking than the rifle's crack. The howling of the wind was the only sound that remained. Cade, seeing the duel's abrupt end, gave the order. Go, go, go. Freed from the sniper's suppression, his team moved with the swift, brutal efficiency of their training, converging on the bunker, securing the now disarmed and utterly bewildered Wraith, and carefully, painstakingly, disarming the pressure plate and freeing a weeping, terrified Dr. Finch. As the sun began to crest the distant peaks, casting a warm, golden light over the scene of the cold grey conflict, Tessa stood over the captured Wraith. He was on his knees, his hands bound behind him, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at her, his eyes burning with the fury of a god who had been toppled from his throne. "You," he spat, the word a curse. Tessa looked down at him, and she felt no triumph, no satisfaction. She just felt a deep, profound sadness for the brilliant, broken man he had become, for the soldier who had lost his way in the dark. She had won, not by killing him, but by outthinking him, by choosing a path that was not steeped in death. She had held on to her humanity, and in the end, it had been the sharper weapon. Without a word, she turned and walked away. Later, as the first extraction chopper, a heavy, grey Seahawk, beat its way through the thin mountain air to retrieve the prisoners and the SEAL team, a second, smaller, unmarked civilian helicopter landed a short distance away. Commander Thorne was there, waiting for her as she approached, his face etched with relief and a deep, abiding respect. He offered her anything she wanted, a new command, a leadership role in a new, reformed program built around her, full reinstatement with a rank of her choosing. She politely, but firmly, refused. She looked from the captured Wraith being loaded onto the military chopper to the quiet, orderly interior of her own transport. "I faced my ghost, Commander," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not going to become one again." She gave him a small, tired smile. "Tessa Vale has work to do. There's a thermal signature problem on a submersible drone that's been bothering me." As she turned to leave, Cade approached her, his helmet off, his face bare. The arrogance that had defined him in that sterile checkpoint room was completely gone, stripped away by the crucible of the last few days, replaced by a deep, unwavering respect that was honest and true. "Tessa," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "What you did back there, I've never seen anything like it. The skill, the restraint, it was—" He trailed off, unable to find the words. "If you ever need anything," he finally managed. A cleared lane, a quiet word, an annoying lieutenant put in his place. Anything at all. For the first time, a small, genuine smile touched Tessa's lips, reaching her eyes and making them shine in the morning light. "Thanks, Lieutenant. I appreciate that." She paused, a flicker of playful mischief in her gaze. "Just try not to make me take my jacket off in front of your men again. It causes way too much paperwork." She boarded her transport, the door sliding shut, sealing her off from the world of shadows she was leaving behind for the second and final time. As the helicopter lifted off, banking over the naval base on its way back to the civilian world, she looked out the window. She was no longer running from her past. She had faced it, confronted its most terrible specter, and she had won, not on its terms, but on her own. She had integrated the two halves of herself, the soldier and the engineer, the ghost and the woman. She was Tessa Vale, engineer, and she was Valkyrie, the ghost who had finally learned how to live in the light. The final shot was of her face serene, and her eyes clear, at peace, as she flew back to her quiet, orderly life, a life that was now not a necessity, but a choice she had earned.